Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Medill. We're very glad to have you with us this evening for what should be a very, very interesting conversation between Charles and our guest, Brian Rosenthal. I would like to remind you that if you have questions this evening, please post those in the chat or Q&A section below on your screen, and we hope to get to as many of those towards the end of our program as we can. And in the meantime, I'd like to introduce our Dean, Charles Whitaker.
Thank you, Stacey.
Hi, Charles.
Hi, Stacey. Thank you very much. And thank you all for joining us this evening, especially on a very busy evening where another of our distinguished alums, Susan Page, is going to be moderating the vice presidential debate. But we, as our guest has said, are the warm-up act for Susan. Our very distinguished guest this evening is another wonderful alum, Brian Rosenthal, an investigative reporter on the Metro desk of the New York Times and the winner of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize for reporting in investigative reporting for his expose on the New York taxi industry and the predatory lending practices that have shattered the lives of many of the drivers. Prior to joining the Times in 2017, Brian covered state government for the Houston Chronicle and worked for the Seattle Times between 2011 and 2013. He's no stranger to the Pulitzers. In 2017, he was a finalist in the public service category for a Houston Chronicle series on the systemic denial of special education funding and services to tens of thousands of children with disabilities. And in 2015, he was a part of a Seattle Times reporting team that won the Pulitzer for the breaking news category for coverage of a mudslide that killed 43 people. His other honors include 2 George A. Polk Awards, the Selden Ring Award for investigative reporting. He also was a producer for a mini documentary that was nominated for a National Emmy Award in 2019. Brian has served since 2019 as an elected member of the Board of Investigative Reporters and Editors, the largest network of investigative journalists in the world. He's a 2011 Medill grad, grew up in Indiana, and while at Northwestern served as editor-in-chief of the Daily Northwestern, where I first met him when I was on the board of Students Publishing Company. Brian, thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to have you.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be with you, virtually at least.
Yeah, exactly. First off, I want to go on the record as saying when I saw you back in December of 2019 at an alumni event, I said, this series is going to win the Pulitzer Prize. So I predicted this well before anyone else. Others may have thought so, but I was on the record as saying that's true. Will you verify that?
I can verify that, yes.
So let's talk about the genesis of this amazing series. You didn't start out initially to do an investigation of the taxi industry, did you? What was the first story that you landed on? How did this get started?
So the project gets started actually through Michael Cohen, President Trump's former lawyer. He, in 2018, he was investigated by the FBI in connection with the Stormy Daniels payment, and his home and his office was raided by federal agents. And at that time, he became a big news figure, and so the Times assigned 5 reporters to do what we call an investigative profile. And basically, the 5 reporters divided up his life. One person took his work for Trump, which was obviously kind of the plum job on that story. But somebody else took his other legal work, somebody took his family. And I was left with, as the youngest person on the team, was left with kind of an obscure part of his life, which is that Michael Cohen had invested in taxi medallions. Taxi medallion, the permit that allows you to own a cab. By law, half of them have to be owned by the person driving the cab, but the other half can be owned by either big fleets or investors. And Michael Cohen was one of those investors. So I was researching his investment and interviewing a lot of people in the industry. And through that, I learned about some of these problems in the industry with market manipulation and predatory lending. And so after we filed the story about Michael Cohen, I asked my editor if I could then spend some time looking just at the industry itself.
So tell us, first off, explain how the medallion system works and when did it start?
Yeah, so the Taxi Medallion was created in New York City in 1937. And the idea was, before medallions existed, there were all kinds of shady operators that were driving unlicensed cabs, beating down cars, and were transporting people across the city, but there were all these problems with safety. And so they decided to put in place a medallion system where if you wanted to own a cab, you had to get your hands on one of these medallions. They limited it to 13,000 medallions, which were initially issued by the city. The city sold them in 1937 for $10 a piece. But at the time they said, once these medallions are out there and owned by people, they can then be bought and sold just like any other asset. And that's the way the system worked for decades. And then almost 70 some years later, the system started to be manipulated, and that's where we started doing our reporting.
So what causes the bubble? How is the system manipulated? How do we get to the point where these drivers are now sucked into these usury rates for purchasing these medallions?
Yeah, so I think the easiest way to explain it is that for many, many years, there was a focus in the taxi industry where even the big players were focused on making money off the fares, off picking up passengers, taking them places. And the medallion was really just
being a taxi driver. Yeah.
Right. The medallion was really just a permit that allowed them to do that. And starting in the late 1990s and early 2000s, some people in the industry decided that wasn't enough and decided they wanted to make more money, and figured they could make more money by focusing on the medallion as a financial asset. And so there were people that were manipulating the value. There were owners that would buy up a bunch of medallions and then would work to purposely inflate the value of additional medallions. They would purposely overpay to get another medallion to make the ones they already had worth more. There were people that were buying and selling between themselves or between shell companies to increase the value. And there were also, after that, a group of people in the industry who figured they could make a lot of money by issuing loans to people that were interested in buying medallions, especially the individual owner driver. Those half of the medallions that had to be owned by the owner driver. There was a market opportunity because a lot of those people were vulnerable to predatory lending practices. And so increasingly, these loans got issued just like in the housing market. And the terms got looser and looser. The medallion values went higher and higher. And that created the bubble.
And how high did those values go?
So at their highest point, a taxi medallion was selling for $1.3 million.
Yeah. And these were drivers who were making on average like $22,000 a year, right? And how were they able to get a loan for $1 million medallion? How does that happen?
Yeah, and by the way, the loans were structured as balloon loans, which meant that they had to be repaid in 3 years. Yeah. So yeah, it was completely impossible. I mean, the reason they were able to get the loans is that the lenders lowered their standards and did not care what the credit score was, did not care what the income was. There were a lot of interest-only loans where the borrower was not actually paying down the principal ever. They were just funneling interest to the lender, and that made the math work a little bit better because if you're only paying the interest, you're not paying as much. And so even with that, the drivers were still paying most of their income to pay down these loans, and that is where the exploitation was taking place.
And these are largely immigrants searching for the American dream, right? These are generally people, and they're signing these with no real understanding of the terms, no representation. How were they sucked into this? What made them so desperate that they would, sign their lives away essentially for this opportunity?
Well, there were a couple of things. First of all, there was a feeling in the taxi industry, and I actually think it was a pretty sincere feeling, that the value of the medallion would go up forever, much like in the housing market. And that feeling permeated throughout the whole industry. And not just through the industry, it permeated to the city itself, which we haven't talked about yet, but kind of played a unique role in this, because in the early 2000s, it decided it was facing a big budget crisis. And so it decided to sell more medallions as a way to make money. And in doing that, the city actually ran TV ads that talked about how the medallion was a riskless asset, and it was a bulletproof investment. And so when you've got everybody in the industry and everybody in the government telling you that it's a good investment, it's easy to get sucked into that.
It did, just like the housing bubble, it did, prices were rising, and it did seem like that would go on forever in some ways. What then caused the bubble to burst?
Well, bubbles burst. That's what they do. And specifically, the industry got to a point where if the value is high enough, then even if you do everything you possibly can to reduce the monthly payment, including making it interest only, and structuring the terms so the monthly payments are as small as possible. If the value is high enough, that monthly payment is still too high for the revenue that the cab is taking in. And so when it got to 2013, 2014, when the bubble began to burst, the cabs were making on a monthly basis about $4,000, if I'm getting these figures right. But about $4,000, and they were the average monthly payment on the loan was about $3,600. So there was just not a lot of room to go. But of course, the additional factor, which we would be foolish to ignore, is that Uber and Lyft also came in at that time, and kind of at around the same time, and had a impact on revenue. We like to be clear that in New York City, at least, it was a pretty modest impact on revenue.
A lot of people would have put this squarely on the shoulders of Uber, on the rideshare industry, as that they caused the bubble to burst. But you argue that that's not the case, that this actually they may have helped, but they weren't the catalyst for this catastrophe. Yeah.
I think it's important to look at the reality on the ground in New York City, which is that 97% of taxi rides in New York City are either in the core of Midtown Manhattan or to the airports. And that business has been less affected by Uber and Lyft than you might think. And Uber and Lyft has made a killing in the outer boroughs. And they've done well in Manhattan, but they haven't dented the taxi business that much. And in fact, we ran the numbers and found that on a per cab basis, it was actually only about a 10% reduction in revenue for cabs. So, nobody wants to lose 10% of their income, but it shouldn't cause the devastation that we saw and the medallion values to crash by 95%.
Yeah. And New York isn't the only city with this system, right? Chicago operates a similar system. What other cities have a similar medallion system?
Yeah, so the big one, other than New York, is Chicago, but there's also Boston, Philadelphia, and San Francisco. Those are the big ones. In most cities in America, though, they don't mess around with medallion. You get a license to operate a cab, and then you get on the road.
So we have this bubble burst. Drivers' lives are being ruined. When did the rash of suicides start?
So the suicides really started in 2017, 2018, and I guess a little bit into 2019, which is when we were starting our reporting, and we were finding that a number of cab drivers were committing suicide. I think total of 9. and a lot of them, not all of them, but a lot of them had crushing debt and had told their family members and their friends that they just could not bear to deal with the debt that they were soldering. So that is one of the tragic outcomes of this. Of course, the most visceral impact that we saw.
Yeah. What was the taxi and limousine commissions, the TLCs, the regulating bodies' role in kind of creating this, and what was their explanation for how they could be so complicit in essentially driving drivers to their deaths in some ways?
Yeah, Taxi and Limousine Commission is a city agency that oversees the taxi industry, and they have actually a lot of power to oversee loans for Medallion purchases. They see all that paperwork, and they're supposed to be checking that paperwork. However, they have an inherent conflict of interest, or they did in the bubble, which is that they were selling medallions to make money. And we talked to 30 former employees of the Taxi Commission, and they said very clearly that the agency's primary goal was to make money.
How much did the city make?
In total, $855 million for the city. And the other thing we documented was that starting as early as 2010, the bubble again burst in 2014, really. Starting as early as 2010, there were employees within the Taxi and Limousine Commission who were trying to raise alarms and say, hey, this is not sustainable, this is a problem, and they were ignored.
Yeah. Who's Matthew Dowse, and what was his role in this catastrophe?
Matthew Dowse was the chairman of the Taxi and Limousine Commission from 2000 to 2010. So he was there for most of the bubble, which really started in 2002 and went through 2014. He left in 2010, and now since then he's been a lawyer representing the banks that are involved in the taxi industry. The Taxi and Limousine Commission has a long history of being a revolving door between the industry. We documented how a majority of people who have run the Taxi and Limousine Commission either came out of the taxi industry or went to the taxi industry afterwards. So that's very common.
Wow. I want to talk a little bit about process. This was a series of stories, 6 stories on a podcast, on a television show. Did you know when you were reporting that that's the form it was going to take, and how did it wind up taking all of those forms?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually remember very clearly when I started the project, telling a friend of mine that it was only going to be a 2-month thing. And it was just, I was looking at it as a mini project before I found my real investigation. And obviously it turned out a little differently. I have personally never been involved with a project that the more you learn about the subject, the more outraged you become. A lot of the details that I've been sharing unfolded over those 18 months of reporting. And a lot of times you start with a tip and your goal is to prove that tip, and the tip is outrageous. And if you can get to proving it, then, you've done your job. And that was the case in my special ed investigation that you mentioned.
Yeah.
But in this case, we just kept learning more, and especially about these loans. I mean, when we started the project, I was really focused on market manipulation,
Right.
And medallion prices. I wasn't looking at loans at all.
Yeah.
And that really took on a whole life of its own. And so that led to a lot of the additional reporting.
Were your editors pushing you were they like, Brian, when are you going to finish this? Where's that story? I mean, what was it in the newsroom in the day-to-day when you're saying, I'm learning so much? I mean, what were their responses? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very lucky. I have very supportive editor. I went a full calendar year from May of 2018 to May of 2019 without publishing a single story.
That is quite a story.
And they still paid me for that year. So They were very supportive, and my editor in particular, Kirsten Danis, just saw the potential in the story and let me have the time.
How did you know that, again, the shape that it was going to take? How was the decision made that it would be 6 stories? When was it determined that it would be a podcast, and when did the television show come about?
So the television show actually came in very early. It was a very fortunate timing. So in the summer of 2018, the New York Times started filming this new TV show called The Weekly. And the idea was that they were going to go, every week they were going to go behind the scenes of a major investigation. And we were the very first investigation that they started filming and going behind the scenes on. When they started with their filming, they were looking for a project in the newsroom, and this is one that caught their eye. So we knew that was going to happen the whole time. You never know if you're going to get on the Daily, the podcast, until after publication. I really wanted to be on the Daily. I think more people listen to it than read the New York Times now. So that was exciting. And as for the stories, I mean, no, we didn't know. We knew that there's kind of a classic formula with investigative projects that's almost a cliche, which is that you start day one with your kind of overview story, detailing all the bad things that the bad guys did. And then day 2, you have the story about the government and how they failed to stop the bad guys from doing the bad things. And then you have day 3, a narrative that looks at one individual person who was affected by this and really goes deep into their story. And I hate that it's a cliche, but it's basically exactly what we did. Yeah. And with a couple other ones in there, we had to do a story about this guy, Gene Friedman, who just a cartoon villain of a man, and has his his yachts and his townhouses on the French Riviera, and was just somebody we had to write about, so we gave him a story. And then we also figured that we should probably do a story about this happening in other places, and it helped. I love Chicago. It helped. It was Chicago. It was the summer. The Cubs were playing, and so I took the opportunity to go to several Cubs games, and so we did a story about the Chicago taxi industry too.
All right. So the stories didn't necessarily, when you were reporting, were you thinking about the form that the stories were going to take, or did you just report through, have this mass of data, and then start cobbling that into the stories? I'm just sort of interested in the process, the crafting of it.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think with a lot of these projects, it's really trial and error. I filed the first draft for this story in January of 2019, and it ran on May 19th of 2019. So there were a lot of drafts.
That was going to be my next question. Yeah, how many drafts were there?
If I try and count them, it'll give me PTSD, so I won't. But a lot of drafts, and you're kind of figuring out the structure as you go. I mean, we decided pretty early on we were going to make one cab driver be the spine of that first story. But as far as the sections of the story, it was really, we tried out one thing, we saw how it sounded, and then we tweaked it a little bit and tried again.
Oh, cool. Was the editing process, I mean, editing is always painful, but was it painful? Was it, you said recalling it gives you PTSD, but.
No, it wasn't. I kind of hate writing.
I was about to say, I was gonna mention that. You've confessed that you don't like writing.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are reporters that there are some that love both writing and reporting, but I think for the most part, there were some that got into it to write and others that got into it to report. Right. I'm in the latter category. So, the bad thing with a project like that is, so I can go a full year without having a story published. But the good thing is that, if I publish a story, I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full year without having a story published. So I can go a full ye but I have in that time written, maybe 10 stories because it's a draft, and each one, you go through this torturous writing process. So, and you don't get any payoff from it. You don't get to see your name in the paper, and nobody sees it and calls you. So, that's just what I'm talking about is that process.
I understand. I often say, writing is a little like opening a vein. It's often I love to write, but it's still very painful, actually. How many medallion owners did you speak with, and how difficult was it to get them to? Oh, you got them to many of them to open up about their finances and about their lives, and they told very painful stories. Was that hard?
So no, not really, because of how desperate they were. To be honest, we found them at a time when they had been screwed over so much, and they were so desperate that they wanted to tell anybody who would listen, and unfortunately people weren't listening. So when we came through, TV cameras and all in this particular case, and asked them to share, they really opened up. It was pretty easy to find them. There's the best source for us was the JFK taxi lot, which is, I mentioned fares from the airport are a huge part of the taxi industry. And it turns out those fares are very lucrative. You really want to get one of those fares, especially from JFK Airport to Manhattan. And so cab drivers will line up to get those fares, and sometimes wait for an hour or more. And they wait at the JFK taxi lot. And so we were able to go there and find literally hundreds of cab drivers just waiting around with nothing to do. It's a perfect environment to find people. And we made that trip several times. And so, we ended up interviewing 200 cab drivers for the project.
And again, they weren't reluctant to talk. I mean, you sat down with some, and they sort of showed you their loans, and they were really forthcoming about about their finances. And it was not difficult to get them to be so forthcoming.
I mean, there were certainly some that were reluctant to share, but the reason I say that it was relatively easy is because there were just so many of them that were so affected by this. And we kind of had the luxury of, when we found somebody who was not going to bare their soul and show their documents, we said, okay, thank you for your time, we appreciate it, and we moved on. So I also think this population, the cab industry is such an interesting industry, but it's a great industry to report on because you meet people from all over the world, literally. You alluded to this, 95% of cab drivers in New York City were not born in the United States. And I think this population, very hardworking and has a lot of integrity, has a lot of honesty. And I found that it was easier to connect with them than a lot of other people that I've talked with.
That was painful, reading their stories and seeing them in the documentary. I mean, they were really very sympathetic characters. On the other hand, you also contacted, as you said, every major bank and some loan officers. And so we had the villains as well. And while most didn't speak with you, Larry Fisher did. And how did you get him to talk to you? What made him decide that he could actually, I wouldn't say bare his soul, but at least talk?
We gave the same opportunity to everybody, which is the opportunity to share their perspective. And, I say that all people that are the subjects of the story, we're writing the story regardless of whether or not you're going to talk with us. And so it's your decision if you want your perspective included or not. If you choose not to talk, I'll do my best, but you're the one who's going to represent it the most effectively. I also think, you tend to not get the most evil of the villains to sit down with you. And I'm not saying that these people were evil necessarily, but you get the people that were conflicted about what they did.
Conflicted. He was pretty unrepentant about what he did. He didn't feel, I mean, he sort of says he can sleep at night, he's not the only one who did this, caveat emptor, let the buyers beware,
That's a good point. I guess he thought, and he was right in that there were people in the industry that did worse things than he did. And he was willing to talk about that because he was upset by what they did. Like, even compared to his standard of what he did, these other lenders and brokers, Larry Fisher, he was the chief lending officer at Melrose Credit Union. Melrose Credit Union did not do interest-only loans, for example. So they did, low, mostly pay interest loans, but not interest-only loans. So the fact that some lenders did that really outraged him. And so he was kind of willing to talk for that reason, I think.
Okay. That's fair. That's valid. He wasn't a mustache twirling bad guy, but he was still a bad guy. I'm going to spend, before we open it up for questions, just a little time talking about your trajectory, going all the way back to what brought you to Northwestern.
What brought me to Northwestern? Well, I grew up in Indiana, and I did not want to go too far away.
What part of Indiana?
What's that?
What part of Indiana? Where?
West Lafayette. And so I applied to, I applied to 5 colleges. And one of them, which I was pretty confident I would get into, was Indiana University. And then there were 4 colleges that were, I thought, really good that I wasn't sure they were going to accept me: Northwestern, University of Chicago, Washington University in St. Louis, and UPenn. And I just kind of hoped that one would accept me, and in fact, one did. So
only one? We're the only ones that accepted you? You're kidding? No, that's a big loss.
But no, I was attracted. I had worked for the high school newspaper. I'd been the editor of the high school newspaper.
Did you always know you wanted to be a journalist?
Not always. Growing up, I wanted to be a basketball player, but I knew once I got into the later years of high school. And so, there was something very attractive about Medill, of course. The Medill education was very attractive. And like I said, I'm a big Cubs fan, so Chicago was good too.
All right. Did you work for the Daily all 4 years?
Yes.
And what was it like? What first attracted you to the Daily, and what was it like when you got on that staff?
I entered the office of the Daily, I think, before I started classes. And I was obsessed pretty quickly. I was not the first person to graduate to when you start joining the Daily, you start on the development desk, and you're kind of on probation. And you have to do 3 stories, or at least that's the way it worked in my day. And I was not the first one to graduate off that, but I was the second one. And
do you remember?
I think it was Sean Wass, actually, if I'm remembering correctly. I don't hold it against him too much. But I was very invested very quickly. It was and still is a magical place. There's something unique about a college newspaper, where you're working with your peers, you're learning from your peers, and you have a lot of control over what happens. And so I was working, 40-hour weeks at the Daily, in addition to my classes, pretty much from the beginning.
I hate to ask this question because I always know what Daily staffers will say, but how important was working for the Daily in your development as a reporter?
It was extremely important.
Most Daily staffers say it was more important than classes. So I'm glad you were you didn't say that, but go ahead.
I was trying to prevent that. I did learn a lot from the classes, for sure, and it's a great education. But you learn journalism by doing it, and there's a difference between doing it in class and doing it for a newspaper, even if it's the college newspaper.
Yeah.
So.
What was the highlight of your tenure at the Daily, either as editor or reporter?
I was very proud of the fact that I started an investigations desk at the Daily, called the In Focus desk, and that still exists.
It does, yeah.
So yeah, maybe kind of a precursor to my interest in investigative journalism, and we did some really fun stories. I think my favorite was actually working with Sean Ross. We obtained a list of all the members of Deru, the secret society.
I remember that story. Yeah.
And we, people were trying to decide like what to do, and
maybe you explain what Deru is. There may be people out there who don't know what Deru is.
Well, it's a secret society. I mean, it's quasi secret. I mean, people know about it, and it has a bit of a role in the function of Northwestern with planning senior week and planning some. It's kind of a conduit between the seniors and the administration, and there are, I think, 20 or 30 people, seniors in it every year, usually student leaders, and there's a whole process that you have to go through in order to get interviewed without even knowing you're being interviewed. I was interviewed without knowing I was being interviewed, where you're invited to just kind of share your perspective about Northwestern, and it turns out they're judging you. But we just kind of decided, you know what, we got this list and we're journalists, so we literally printed the names of everybody and put it on the front page.
I remember. Yes, I do remember that story. Yeah, it was quite informative. Well, where did you do your I don't remember if we were calling it JR or TN when you were there. Were we calling it JR?
JR at the Seattle Times. I was the first person to go to the Seattle Times.
Oh, wow. What do you remember about that experience?
I had never been to Seattle, I don't think. It was a great experience. I was the night reporter, and I was doing a lot of breaking news, and it was just a great experience. It was by far the biggest newsroom I'd been a part of, and it kind of felt like my first real newsroom that I was in, and I remember being very invigorated by it.
So I see, Stacy, some questions in the chat. Do you want to ask some of those?
Yes. First one, do you know how much a medallion costs in Chicago as compared to New York, and how is it different from New York?
Yeah, so it's a little different. The Chicago taxi industry is a little different because they don't really have the benefit of Midtown, and they aren't as focused on the airports. It's actually a lot of radio call where you'll call for a cab as opposed to just flagging somebody down. Medallions did not get as high as they got in New York. They got as high as about 375,000, and they fell much more. The Chicago taxi industry has been more affected by Uber and Lyft for sure.
Absolutely.
And medallions are basically worthless at this point. They're selling for maybe $10,000, if that. So
we haven't seen the rash of suicides here that we saw in New York. I mean, is there a reason for that? Have these drivers not been as devastated by the burst of the bubble?
I mean, I think it's. The numbers are obviously smaller. I mean that in terms of the number of drivers who are affected. And we're talking about pretty small sample sizes. I mean, 9 cab drivers out of 13,000 in New York. If there are only, I think, 2,000 medallions in Chicago, you'd only expect, like, even if it was the same ratio, it would only be like 2 or 3. And when you're talking about that small sample size, I'm not sure it's really.
But I just haven't even heard the same stories of complete and utter devastation certainly the industry has been hollowed out, but I haven't heard as much about the individual I haven't heard as much about the individual cab drivers' stories. Is that just because we have reported? I mean, so there was your story, but I haven't seen as much. I haven't seen the Chicago media focus on that as much.
Now that I'm remembering, I believe Chicago also does not have the rule where half of medallions have to be owned by the person driving the cab.
That's true.
And as a result, I think the number of medallions, most of them are owned by fleets, and there are fewer owner-drivers.
That's probably true. That would account for it, yeah. Stacy, other questions?
Yep. What feedback did you receive from people you reported on after the series was published?
I mean, it ran the gamut. There were there were people who were, I mean, the cab drivers themselves were very happy that we got attention on them and their struggles. Some of them actually thought we did not focus on Uber and Lyft enough, which was kind of interesting. There were cab drivers who thought, if only not for Uber and Lyft, the medallion would be worth $1 million again, and so Uber and Lyft was the problem, and we had to kind of tell them, no, the whole thing, like, you never should have been able to buy a medallion in the first place.
That's hard to hear, yes.
Which is hard to hear, yeah. So there were cab drivers that were frustrated with that element, but most were very happy. And then in terms of the subjects of the story, the regulators, the bankers, the brokers.
What were the policy implications of the story?
Well, a lot of policy implications. There are several criminal investigations that are still going on, including by the U.S. Department of Justice. There were a series of reforms that were passed, changing how medallions are bought and sold, and the rules for that. The biggest thing, there were some new policies put in place about, and some new efforts put in place to help cab drivers with their financial understanding, driver assistance centers. There was $10 million in fees owed by cab drivers that were waived. The big thing,
forgiveness, any effort to try to get them out of these loans?
So the big thing was whether the city was going to issue a bailout, and the city put together a task force to look at that, and they issued a report this past February of 2020, endorsing a $550 million bailout proposal. At around the same time, late February of this year, the Attorney General of New York announced that she was suing the city of New York for $810 million and for its role in the medallion crisis. And she said that she was going to use that money to bail out the cab drivers. So both of those things were happening. And but again, the key is that happened in February of 2020, and then the pandemic hit. And I don't know if you've heard, but it's been kind of bad in New York. And so everything is kind of on hold, right. and we still don't know.
Well, that's too bad.
The other thing I was just going to say about reaction that I was laughing about was I actually got several emails and texts after the Pulitzer announcement from the bankers and brokers who were mentioned in the story, and some of the ones who were angry with the story, congratulating me
really?
on the project. I guess they were excited to have been a part of it. But so,
no, this is bad press, I guess. Anyway.
I guess so. Yeah.
So one of our guests would like to know, how do you move on after reporting on one story for so long?
Yeah, good question.
It's a tough one. Some people compare doing a long project to having a baby. You know, it's with you.
Not a good comparison. There are many people who are not going to appreciate that. But okay.
Well, it's something that you're working on. It's with you maybe for a number of months, and then you finally it comes out in the world.
Yeah.
But of course, it's not like that at all for many reasons. But also because, you don't. You get to keep the baby. You have a baby, and I actually find it's really tough to move on. And especially when you have been living and breathing something for so long, and you're so well connected and well versed in everything, it's hard to set that aside. But we're journalists, and I get excited about the opportunity to learn something new, to meet new people, to fight to help new people. I try and focus on that, and that's kind of what gets me going on a new project again.
Stacy?
So I'll combine a couple of these. So we're curious to know what did you learn at Medill that you still use today, and do you have advice for our young journalist students?
Both good questions.
Yeah, good question. It's hard to isolate what I learned at Medill specifically, as opposed to, at an internship or other parts early on in my career. But I will isolate one thing, which is that I took 2011, the storefront class. I think it was 2011, with David Nelson.
Oh, wow.
And we were in Edgewater, and one day in class, I had written a front page story for the Daily Northwestern that I was very happy about. And Nelson took the liberty of going through it and circling every instance of passive voice in the story.
That is so David Nelson, yes.
And really, he circled it in red, and then handed me the paper, and that was a big lesson. And to this day, I think about that, and I try to be very active, not just avoiding passive voice, but I try and use very active and vivid language. And whenever I do that, I think about that. So that's one thing. I mean, Medill in general and the Daily and those early internships really taught me how to, the basics of reporting, the ethics of reporting, and the importance of doing reporting for your community. And I feel like those building blocks are with me on the projects that I do now. I mean, people ask, how different is investigative reporting from beat reporting, and or how different is it to be a reporter for the New York Times versus the Daily Northwestern? And in reality, on both of those questions, I think it's really not that different. Everything that you learn is exactly the types of things you're doing on a day-to-day basis when you're working on an investigative project for the New York Times. You're thinking about, why, what, when, where. You are working on those interviewing skills, and you're thinking critically in much the same way.
Nice. Yep, Stacy?
We would tell us about the moment you found out you won the Pulitzer. Has that changed anything for you?
I was very surprised.
Were you really?
I was.
I told you this was going to happen.
I should have listened to Dean Whitaker. The New York Times has not won a Pulitzer in the local reporting category. They've only won once in the last 50 years. And the good news is we were not in the local reporting category. We were in the investigative reporting category. But this was fundamentally a local story. I felt like it was unlikely that the board was going to recognize a local story from the New York Times at a time when local journalism is hurting so much, and we want to do everything we can to support local journalism and promote it. And so I was surprised for that reason. And as far as it's changed anything, I mean, not really. I got to come here, which is great. And I get to put it on my resume, but you would be surprised. I mean, the day after I won, I was trying to get my editor's attention on a story, and she was completely ignoring me because she was working on something else. And I'm like, well, what's going on here?
Pulitzer, right? What does the guy got to do to get an ear here? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Exactly.
One of our faculty members, John Marshall, wants to know, can you share some of your COVID reporting experiences? And also, how has the pandemic affected your reporting?
Yeah, I mean, it's affected it a lot. I now report from my home exclusively. I have actually, I was thinking about this. I have not gone out and onto the street or to meet with anybody in person for reporting since the pandemic began.
Since March?
Yeah, some reporters have. I do so much work with data, documents, and that type of reporting that I just haven't. I do find it's easier to reach people now because everybody's just at home. So that's great. But the pandemic obviously has also been a big subject for everybody, and me included. I was involved in a lot of the day-to-day coverage in the beginning when the pandemic was nearing its peak in New York. I was doing a lot of daily coverage, and after that, I spent several months looking into inequality in how the coronavirus has affected different populations in New York. Obviously, it's been much more devastating for Black New Yorkers, for Brown New Yorkers, and for low-income folks. And I focused specifically on the quality of care that different populations were receiving. I did a project looking at what would happen if you got the coronavirus and had to be hospitalized and ended up going to a hospital serving wealthy Manhattan residents versus if you were going to a safety net hospital that's mostly serving low-income people in Queens or Brooklyn or the Bronx. And that was a very important story.
How do you do that story? Again, that's a story that typically would have, some anecdotal element of it, some narrative about a person who's affected, and you're not getting out there. How do you do that? How do you find that person, and how do you do that reporting when you're doing it all remotely?
Yeah, so we actually didn't have any anecdotes for that story, maybe for that reason.
Yeah.
Also because it's hard to put pressure on a case in a situation like that. How do you prove that what happened to somebody was because of the hospital they went to? And how do you prove that tie that to a systematic problem at the hospital?
Yeah.
It's doable, and it has been done. I think the Washington Post did a really good story out of Brazil talking about that. But it's a really high bar. It's very difficult to prove.
Yeah.
So we were mostly talking to doctors and nurses and other hospital employees. We were looking at the mortality rates. We obtained and analyzed and found that the mortality rates in these safety net hospitals in low-income areas was 3 times higher than at the wealthy hospitals in Manhattan. And we were also talking to doctors about the equipment that they had, the staff ratios that they had, the access to advanced treatments that they had. And so we're really going at it from that angle as opposed to the individual cases.
Stacey?
Al Cubbage has a very important question. He wants to know, do you think the Cubs can win the series again in your lifetime?
Ow. Not with the offense that they showed in the playoffs, or lack thereof.
It's been a frustrating few years. I mean, I've got hope. I mean, I'm hoping to live for a long time. So, hopefully sometime. But it's not looking good for anytime soon.
Don't you think they're going to blow up the team after this series?
I mean, I think you have to. I think that, yeah, I do. I mean, we could talk about the Cubs.
I'm sorry. We don't mean to digress.
we have another question. One question: any interest in writing a book based on the taxi investigation?
Oh yeah.
I have been asked, and I thought about it. I mean, the only reason I would, or the biggest reason I would, is the taxi industry is such a fascinating industry.
It is, yeah.
And there are so many colorful characters. But I do think that when you spend 18 months reporting about something, and you do the podcast and you do the TV show, I was ready to move on and find another area to dig into. So, if I felt like there was something I hadn't said, then I would look at that. But I feel like we said everything in our series.
Mhm.
So no, I would not look out for a book anytime soon.
Fair enough.
We've got one more question here, I think from a student perhaps. In this tough job market for journalists, what would be your advice for new journalism program graduates who are seeking opportunities in employment? What is some of the best career advice you ever received?
Yeah, so I would say number one, internships are so important. Everybody says that, but it's so true. That is really where you can make the connections that you need to make. I would also say just really being.
How many did you have prior to or before or after JR?
I did a total of 5 internships.
Wow.
So in addition to JR, I did every summer after college. And not to
High school.
What's that?
Every summer after high school. You said every summer after college.
Well, every summer during college.
During college.
So freshman, sophomore, junior, senior.
Okay. All right.
And I think it's useful to look at my career trajectory. After I did all those internships, my first job out of college was at the Seattle Times. They called me and asked me to come back as a fellow, which I did, and then was promoted to being a full-time reporter. After that, I got a call from Vernon Loeb, an old editor of mine at the Washington Post, where I'd also interned, and he asked me to come down and work for him at the Houston Chronicle. And so I did that, and I was there for 3 years, and then I did the investigation about special ed that you mentioned, and that got some attention. And so at that point, I got a call from the New York Times asking me to come up and interview with them. So the moral of the story is I have never successfully applied for a job and gotten a job. I have unsuccessfully applied for many jobs in between there. But I've never successfully applied for a job. And I think it's a testament to you doing the internships and you making the connections and keeping in touch with those connections, which is so important, and doing it in a natural, organic way, not like you're trying to get something out of your mentors, but you are having a beneficial co-relationship with them, mutually beneficial relationship with them, and really relying on those networks and then relying on the work that you do. I mean, in journalism these days, there are a lot of opportunities, and I feel like more than ever, it is based on the quality of work that you do. And so you can, especially if you're willing to start at a place that's a more local newspaper or media outlet, a digital outlet, and is going to give you the opportunity to do really ambitious stories or do your own work as opposed to being a cog in a machine of a big place. You can really prove yourself, and that's how you'll rise. I mean, I think that's the best career advice that I can give.
Is there one more, Stacey? If not, I will take the final question.
No, go right ahead.
So what's on the horizon? What is next for you? What are you going to write? Do you see yourself writing books? Where do you go from here?
I would like to write a book someday. If anybody has any ideas for a book, let me know.
You have an idea? You just consider you want to write a book.
Okay. I feel very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in. I'm doing exactly what I want to do.
At a pretty young age.
At a pretty young age, yeah. And being on the Metro investigations team at the New York Times, I feel like it's the best of both worlds because I love local journalism. I've always done local journalism, and I still get to do that. It's just that the locality is New York City, the most important city in the world, in my opinion. Maybe with Chicago accepted. But I get to do that, and I get the time to do ambitious stories, and yet I'm at the New York Times, and I have the resources of the Times and all the editing and the staff there. So I would like to find another project like this. I'm working on a possible one right now, and I just want to keep doing these investigative projects that are about important issues and that make a difference. I mean, the impact is really what I'm most gratified by and interested in. So if I can do another, 20, 30, whatever, just projects just like the Taxi project, that would be great.
Well, Brian, congratulations on all your success. You make us very proud. We're very happy to claim you as a Medillion. And thank you for your time this evening. We really appreciate it. I love talking to you. I could spend another hour or so asking questions, but I will let you go and let our audience go to watch the debate. Thank you so much.
We'll talk about the Cubs later.
We're going to talk about the Cubs. Exactly.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you, Charles. I just wanted to let our audience know that we have a couple of programs coming up with Medill. Tomorrow evening, we're doing a program with our IMC program called Investors as Change Agents. It's how investment firms are encouraging companies to change their behavior. And then on the 20th of October, which is a Tuesday evening, we have our return of our previous Medill Dean, Lauren Giglione, and his co-authors as they discuss their new book, Genus Americanus, Hitting the Road in Search of America's Identity. And the topic is very current and should be a really interesting conversation. So please visit our Medill website. All the details and how to register and get more information about the Zoom events are on our website. And we thank you all for coming this evening. Thanks again, gentlemen.
Good night, everyone. Good night, Brian. Take care.
Good night.